The combine had barely rolled to a stop when Dale Hutchinson heard it. Laughter, not the polite kind. Not the kind that fades when someone looks up and realizes they've been caught. This was the full-throated, back-slapping, side-splitting laughter of men who were absolutely certain they were watching a fool at work, and were enjoying every second of it. It was September of 1983, and the field in front of Dale Hutchinson looked like nothing any man in Pemiscot County, Missouri had ever seen before. Let me tell you about Pemiscot County, Missouri in 1983. If you've never been to the Missouri Boothiel, picture this. Take a perfectly flat piece of earth, press it between two rivers, the Mississippi to the east, the St. Francis to the west, drain it, ditch it, and farm it until there's nothing left to farm but determination and borrowed money. The Boothiel sits at the very bottom of Missouri like a geographic afterthought, a rectangular jut of land that geographically belongs to Arkansas but politically belongs to the Show-Me State, and the men who farmed it were as hard-headed and proud as the land itself demanded them to be. The summer of 1983 had been punishing. The heat came in June, and it never really left, a wet, thick Mississippi Delta-adjacent heat that made the air feel like warm flannel pressed against your face. Corn tasseled early. Soybeans set pods in temperatures that hovered around 97 degrees for 11 consecutive days in July. The ditches along the county roads ran low, and the old-timers talked about 1936 the way they always talked about 1936, quietly, with their eyes down, hoping this year wouldn't become its own cautionary tale. The farm community of Caruthersville, county seat of Pemiscot, was built on flatland agriculture, the way cathedral towns were built on faith. The co-op elevator on Truman Boulevard was the tallest structure for miles. The John Deere dealership on Highway 84, run by a man named Gerald Fitch, had just taken delivery of 8 new 4250 tractors, each one forest green and gleaming, priced at $47,000 apiece. The Farm Bureau office on Ward Avenue had a waiting room full of men who no longer smiled when they sat down. Because 1983 was not just a hard year for the weather. It was a hard year for everything. Commodity prices had been collapsing since 1980. Corn that had touched $3.60 a bushel in 1980 was fighting to hold $2.85 by harvest of '83. Soybeans, the crop that Boothiel farmers bet their lives on, had dropped from $7.80 a bushel to $5.60, and there were rumors, the kind that spread through co-op waiting rooms like smoke under a door, that they might go lower still. The land payment notices were going out, the foreclosure auctions were starting. And Dale Hutchinson had a plan that every single man in Pemiscot County thought was pure foolishness. Dale Hutchinson was not an impressive-looking man. He stood 5'9" in his work boots, weighed maybe 165 pounds after a big dinner, and had a face that had been working outdoors since 1942, when he was 19 years old, and his father handed him the reins on 80 acres of bottom ground that the family had tenant farmed since the 1920s. By 1983, he owned 240 acres outright, a remarkable thing for a man whose family had started with nothing, and rented another 160 from the Simmons estate out of Memphis. He drove a 1974 International Harvester 1066 tractor that he'd bought used in 1977 for $14,200, and maintained with a stubborn precision that his neighbors alternately respected and found incomprehensible. When Gerald Fitch at the John Deere dealership tried to sell him a new 4250 in the spring of '83, easy financing, Dale, she'll pay for herself. Dale had looked at the machine the way a man looks at a beautiful horse he knows he can't afford to feed, thanked Gerald politely, and driven home in his 1966 Ford pickup. His wife, Ruth, had been teaching 3rd grade at Caruthersville Elementary for 21 years. Their son, Tommy, was finishing an agriculture degree at the University of Missouri. Their daughter, Carol, had married a grain elevator manager in Haiti and given them 2 grandchildren who visited on Sundays. Dale Hutchinson was, by every external measure, a thoroughly ordinary Boothiel farmer. But let me tell you what made Dale Hutchinson different. He read, voraciously, obsessively, in a way that was slightly unusual for a man of his time and place. Not novels, agricultural bulletins, university extension publications, the Missouri Farm Bureau News, back issues of Successful Farming going back to 1968, stacked in chronological order in his barn office beside a Maxwell House coffee can full of pencils. He subscribed to the University of Missouri Extension Service publications, and when new research came out of the agronomy department in Columbia, it showed up in Dale's mailbox and it got read. In 1978, he'd read an article in a University of Illinois Extension bulletin. He'd gotten it through an exchange with a contact at the Sikeston Extension office about something called intercropping. More specifically about a practice some agronomists were calling corn-soybean relay intercropping. The concept was not new. Subsistence farmers around the world had grown multiple crops in the same field for centuries. But the modern research applying it to Midwest commodity agriculture was new enough to be interesting and established enough to be credible. Dale had read that article 3 times. Then he'd filed it in a manila folder he labeled in his careful handwriting, "Relay Cropping Possible." For 5 years, he left that folder in his filing cabinet and thought about it. Gerald Fitch was 44 years old in 1983, and he was, by the standards of Pemiscot County, a successful man. His John Deere dealership, Fitch Farm Equipment, Incorporated 1971, grossed $2.3 million in 1982 and was projected to do better in '83 despite the farm crisis, partly because Gerald understood something that his competitors did not. When farmers are desperate, they don't stop buying equipment. They buy different equipment. They trade up, convinced that the new machine will be the thing that finally turns the corner. Gerald Fitch was very good at helping men convince themselves of this. He was broad-shouldered, kept his dark hair combed perfectly at all times, wore western-cut shirts with pearl snap buttons, and drove a 1983 Chevrolet Silverado Midnight Black that he traded every 2 years without exception. He was the kind of man who stood at the center of conversations at the Farm Bureau meetings, who told the joke that everyone laughed at, who clapped other men on the shoulder just a half-second longer than was strictly comfortable. He was not evil, let's be clear about that. He was something more ordinary and perhaps more dangerous. He was completely certain of his own judgment, and he had been successful enough, long enough, that no one in Pemiscot County had given him a genuine reason to doubt it. Gerald had heard about Dale Hutchinson's planting plan through the usual channels, which in Caruthersville meant that Dale had mentioned it to one person, and by the following Tuesday it had traveled through the co-op coffee clutch, the Farm Bureau waiting room, the diner on Ward Avenue, and arrived at Gerald Fitch's service counter approximately the way rumors always arrive, louder, more extreme, and more entertaining than the original. Gerald's response, delivered to a group of 6 farmers gathered around the parts counter on a Thursday morning in April, had become something of a local legend. 2 crops in 1 field, he'd said, not even looking up from the parts catalog. Dale Hutchinson is gonna plant 2 crops in 1 field. He let that sit for a moment, then he looked up slow with a half-smile that didn't reach his eyes. You know what else you can do with 1 field? You can plant money, just throw $20 bills in the ground. At least then when nothing comes up, you can say you started with something. The laughter in that parts room had carried out through the service bay and into the parking lot. And someone had made sure Dale Hutchinson heard about it before the week was out. The morning of May 3, 1983, was the kind of Bootheel spring morning that makes you briefly forget everything bad you know about Bootheel summers. 62 degrees. A southwest breeze coming up off the Arkansas line carrying the smell of turned earth and something distant and green. The kind of morning that makes a farmer feel, for a few hours, like things might actually work. Dale had his 1066 International fueled and ready by 6:15 a.m., his planter, a 1972 John Deere 494A 4-row unit he'd modified with his own hands over 3 winters, hitched and calibrated. He was planting his bottom 40 along the St. Francis River levee, and he was doing it in a configuration that no one in Pemiscot County had ever done commercially. Corn first in 30-inch rows. Soybeans to follow in 15-inch bands between the corn rows, planted 6 weeks later when the corn was knee-high, tall enough to let the soybeans establish without being shaded out, but not so tall that the field equipment couldn't still navigate. It was a precise operation. The timing margin was maybe 2 weeks in either direction before the whole system fell apart. Dale had run the numbers 40 different ways. He was planting the corn on May 3rd. He would plant the soybeans on June 15th. He would harvest the soybeans in September before the corn was ready, using a modified header. He would harvest the corn in October in the conventional manner. 2 harvests, 1 field, 1 growing season. The theory was sound, the research was real. The execution had never been attempted at commercial scale in Pemiscot County by anyone who didn't have a university budget behind them. Now let me pause here and ask you something. How many times in your own life have you known something was right, known it in that deep, quiet, evidence-based way that doesn't make noise but doesn't waver either, while everyone around you was absolutely certain you were wrong? How many times have you stood in front of your own 40 acres, metaphorically speaking, and heard the laughter from the fence line? Dale Hutchinson knew that feeling. He'd known it since April. But what happened on May 7th was something beyond the usual casual mockery of a farming community not yet convinced. May 7th was a Saturday, which meant the co-op on Truman Boulevard had its usual Saturday morning gathering. 8, 10, sometimes 12 men drinking co-op coffee out of styrofoam cups, talking prices and weather and equipment, and gossip with the efficient, circular logic of men who have run out of things to control, and so have perfected the art of analyzing everything else. Dale had stopped in for a bag of cover crop seed. He was at the counter when Gerald Fitch arrived, unplanned as far as anyone knew, with two of the larger cash grain farmers in the county. Brothers named Beaumont, Harold and Roy Beaumont, who together farmed 1,800 acres of Pemiscot County's finest ground and had just taken delivery of two of Gerald's new John Deere 4250s. The co-op counter was not a large space. Gerald saw Dale. Gerald smiled. "Dale Hutchinson," he said, loud enough for every man in the room to hear. "The intercropper." He said the word the way you'd say flat earther, with a kind of theatrical bewilderment, as if the concept itself was so far outside normal human cognition that he could barely make his mouth form the syllables. "Boys, you heard about this. Dale here is going to plant his bottom 40 in 2 crops at once. Corn and soybeans, same field, same time." Harold Beaumont, the older one heavyset, who wore the same cat diesel cap every single day from March to November, looked at Dale with something close to pity. "That right?" 6 weeks apart, Dale said, his voice steady. "Corn first, soybeans into the standing corn in June." "Into the standing corn," Roy Beaumont repeated. "Into the standing corn," Dale confirmed. The room was quiet for exactly 2 seconds. Then Gerald Fitch started laughing, that full, genuine, delighted laugh of a man who believes he has just heard the funniest thing in a very good week, and the room went with him. Not all of it. Not the young extension agent near the door who looked at his coffee cup. Not old Charlie Pressler, who'd been farming Pemiscot ground since 1951 and had learned that the universe did not owe mockery to men who worked hard. But most of it. Enough of it. Harold Beaumont, still looking at Dale with that expression of sorrowful bewilderment, shook his head slowly. "Dale," he said, "I say this with respect, you are going to lose that 40 acres. "I'm not going to lose it," Dale said. "What do you think it costs him?" Gerald said, still grinning, turning to Roy Beaumont. "When those soybeans come up stunted under 40-acre corn, what's the loss on that?" "On 40 acres of beans at what, 30 bushels?" Roy was doing the math. "At 5.60 a bushel, that's about $6,000, Dale said quietly. "That's what I'd lose if it fails the way you're describing." $6,000, Gerald said. He let the number hang in the air. "Dale, I'll tell you what, you go ahead and plant your 2-crop field, and when it fails," he paused for the smile, "and it will fail, you come see me about that 4250. I'll even throw in the header." More laughter, easier now, comfortable. Dale picked up his bag of seed. "I'll see you in October, Gerald," he said, and he walked out into the May morning. What Dale Hutchinson knew, and what Gerald Fitch and the Beaumont brothers and the entire co-op Saturday morning congregation did not know, wasn't magic. It wasn't luck. It wasn't even genius. It was 5 years of careful reading, careful thinking, and one very important piece of information about commodity prices that most Pemiscot County farmers hadn't fully processed yet. Let me explain the intercropping system Dale had designed, because it deserves explanation. The concept he'd taken from those University of Illinois Extension bulletins, and refined with additional research from Missouri Extension publications, correspondence with an agronomist at the University of Kentucky named Dr. James Wendell, and 2 visits to an experimental intercropping plot at the Southeast Missouri State University Research Farm in Malden, was called relay intercropping, not simple double cropping, which was planting one crop after another in sequence. Relay intercropping meant overlapping the growing seasons of 2 crops in the same space at the same time. The key insight, the thing that made it work, was canopy management. Corn in its early growth stages doesn't shade the ground as severely as people assume. For the first 6 weeks, a corn plant is growing mostly up, not out. The canopy doesn't close until the corn is roughly waist high. which means there's a window, a 6-week window, during which a shorter companion crop can be established in the understory of the corn before the light competition becomes prohibitive. Soybeans, planted in 15-inch bands between 30-inch corn rows in the third week of June in Pemiscot County's climate, would germinate and establish their first 2 or 3 leaf stages while the corn canopy was still open enough to let them thrive. By the time the corn shaded out that zone, the soybeans would be developed enough to handle reduced light during pod fill. They wouldn't produce maximum yields, but they would produce. Dale's research suggested he could expect 60 to 70% of a standard soybean yield from his intercropped beans. Not as good as a dedicated soybean field, but his corn was still there, producing full corn yields in the same 40 acres. He was, in effect, farming 80 acres worth of production from 40 acres of ground. Now here's where the price crash calculation becomes important. And let me tell you, this is where Dale Hutchinson's reading habit paid off in a way that none of the men at the co-op counter had thought through. Dale had been following the USDA commodity price projections since 1981. He'd read the analyses in the Missouri Farm Bureau News about the Soviet grain embargo, about the Brazilian soybean expansion, about the overproduction that had followed the land rush of the 1970s. He wasn't a commodity market expert. He didn't claim to be, but he'd read enough to understand the direction things were going. Corn prices were likely to stay under $3 for the foreseeable future. Soybean prices were almost certainly going lower, possibly to $5 a bushel or below, once the Brazilian harvest of 83-84 hit the market. But here was the thing that made Dale's system not just agronomically interesting but financially vital. When prices crash, diversification doesn't save you. But volume with diversification might. If corn dropped to $2.75 and beans dropped to $5, a farmer with a dedicated 40-acre cornfield would gross maybe $110 per acre, roughly $4,400 total, on what had been, 3 years ago, a $6,000 field. Dale's intercropped 40 acres, producing full corn yields and 65% soybean yields, would grow something closer to $165 per acre, on the same ground, with the same taxes, with the same debt service. It wasn't a windfall, it was survival math. And Dale had done the survival math. He had also done one more thing that very few of his neighbors had thought to do. In the spring of 1983, he had written a letter, a careful, polite 6-paragraph letter on his kitchen table, to the Pemiscot County Farm Service Agency office, describing his intended cropping system and asking in advance whether his planned intercropping approach would affect his commodity program participation. The answer came back in 14 days. It would not. His corn acreage base was intact. His soybean acreage, because he was seeding it into existing cropland, not certifying a new soybean base, would be marketed as an additional crop without triggering base acreage complications under the specific program provisions then in effect. He was clear to proceed. He had made sure in writing with a response on file before he planted a single seed. Let me pause here and ask you something. When you're doing something no one around you has done before, something that requires not just courage but precision, how many people take the time to check every single detail before they commit, to write the letter, to wait for the answer, to make sure they're protected before the ground is turned? Dale Hutchinson wrote the letter. June 15th arrived cool and overcast, which Dale took as a gift. The corn was standing at 22 inches, slightly below his target of 24 but within his operational window. The canopy was open. The soil had adequate moisture from a rain on June 11th. Conditions were, by the careful standards of a man who had been watching weather forecasts since May like a sailor reading currents, as close to ideal as he was going to get. He started the 1066 International at 5:45 in the morning. The modified 494A planter. He'd spent 3 evenings in January reconfiguring the row units to a 15-inch spacing, using parts sourced from a salvaged 4-row unit he'd bought for $340 at a consignment auction in Sykeston, went into the corn rows at 6:02 a.m. The soybean variety was Williams 82, a Group IV variety with proven performance in southeast Missouri's climate, developed by the Illinois Agricultural Experiment Station and released in 1980. Dale had ordered his seed in February from the Growmark dealer in Haiti, 78-pound bags. He'd calculated his seeding rate for the reduced row spacing, accounting for the corn-occupied ground, and ordered exactly 14 bags. The planter moved through the standing corn with the particular sound that farming makes when it's going right, the steady diesel throb of the 1066, the rattle and click of the seed plates, the soft percussion of the row cleaners moving through the corn residue. The corn plants, waist-high and dark green in the early morning light, stood on either side of the planter units like an audience that hadn't yet decided what it thought of the performance. Dale drove the rows until 11:30 a.m. He broke for 30 minutes a thermos of coffee Ruth had packed, 2 biscuits sitting on the running board of the pickup at the field edge. The overcast had held, which meant the soil temperature at planting depth was staying in the mid-70s, optimal for soybean germination. He went back to it at noon. He finished the 40 acres at 4:47 p.m. He sat in the cab of the 1066 for a long moment after the last row, engine idling, looking at what he'd done. From the cab, the field looked almost normal, the corn rows standing regular and green, the freshly worked soil between them showing the faint lines of the planter passes. You had to know what you were looking at to see it. Dale Hutchinson knew what he was looking at. He drove the tractor to the barn, shut down the engine, and walked to the house for supper. Ruth asked him how it went. "Good," he said, "real good. Now let me take you to the second week of September." The morning of September 14th, 1983 had a quality that serious farmers recognize immediately, a clarity that comes when the summer humidity finally breaks, when the light shifts from its thick August amber to something crisper and more angular. The kind of morning that means harvest is not coming, harvest is here. Dale's soybeans had emerged on June 24th, 9 days after planting, exactly within normal range. They had grown through July in the corn's partial shade, shorter and more leggy than a full-sun soybean, but green and setting pods by early August. The corn had tasseled in late July and begun silk development right on schedule. For 6 weeks, Dale had watched his unusual field the way a surgeon watches a patient coming out of anesthesia, checking, every day, for the signs that would tell him whether his calculations had held. They had held. The soybeans were ready on September 14th. Full pods, yellow leaves beginning. A pod shatter risk assessment Dale did by hand, walking the rows, checking pod moisture, counting the percentage of mature brown pods, told him he had a 3 to 5 day harvest window before pod shatter loss became significant. He'd arranged, 6 weeks earlier, for the loan of a combine header from his neighbor Carl Wessels, a 1979 International Harvester 1460 combine with a 13-foot flex header that could be adjusted to a cutting height low enough to harvest the soybeans while clearing the still-standing corn. Carl had been skeptical when Dale asked. He'd been less skeptical when Dale explained the arrangement in detail, and he'd been something close to impressed when Dale showed him the crop in late August. "You pulled it off," Carl had said, standing at the field edge on a Tuesday afternoon in late August, looking at soybeans running between standing corn in 40-acre rows that disappeared into the distance. "Dale, you actually pulled it off." "Not yet," Dale said. "Ask me again after I've got them in the bin." The IH 1460 came across the road from Carl's farm at 7:30 a.m. on September 14th. Dale made his first combine pass at 7:47 a.m. The header moved through the corn rows at cutting height clear of the corn stalks, taking the soybeans at approximately 8 inches off the ground with the careful, particular sound of a flex header doing what it was designed to do. Soybeans fed into the concave. The unloading auger turned. The first load of beans yellow-tan clean, the particular dry, dusty smell of mature soybeans filling the cab, went into Dale's grain wagon at 8:23 a.m. He drove 2 loads to the Caruthersville Co-op elevator that afternoon. The elevator ticket for the first day's harvest, 847 bushels of Williams 82 soybeans, moisture at 13.2%, dockage minimal, price that day $5.45 per bushel. $4,616.15 deposited to Dale Hutchinson's account at First National Bank of Caruthersville. On the second day, he harvested the remaining portion of the 40 acres and delivered another 612 bushels. On September 16, 1983, Dale Hutchinson deposited a check for $3,335.40 into his account. Total soybean revenue from his 40-acre intercrop, $7,951.55. The corn was still standing. Word had spread because in Pemiscot County, word always spread, and on the morning of September 15th, when Dale was making his second day of soybean passes through the standing corn, there were 7 men standing at the fence line along County Road 318. One of them was Gerald Fitch. He stood with his arms crossed, wearing his pearl snap shirt and his black Silverado sunglasses, watching the it.1460 move through that impossible field. He didn't say anything for a long time. Nobody said anything, because there was nothing to say. The combine was saying it for them. Let me tell you about the silence that fell over Pemiscot County agriculture in those first 2 weeks of September 1983, because it was a specific kind of silence. Not the silence of confusion, not the silence of ignorance. The silence of men who are watching something they told themselves couldn't work working. The silence of a recalibration happening in real time. It's a particular quality of quiet. Gerald Fitch stood at that fence line on County Road 318 for 45 minutes on the morning of September 15th. Dale saw him there during a turn at the end of the field. Their eyes met briefly, Dale in the cab of the it.1460, Gerald at the fence line, and then Dale turned the combine and went back down the row. There was no confrontation, no conversation, nothing dramatic. Just the sound of the combine and the beans going in the tank and the corn standing patiently, still on the stalk, still weeks from its own harvest, in the September morning. Harold Beaumont drove by twice, slowed both times, kept going. Carl Wessels, running the combine, told Dale later that he'd counted 11 different vehicles slow down on County Road 318 during that second day of harvest. 11 different sets of eyes, watching something that was supposed to fail, not failing. Old Charlie Pressler, the man who'd sat quiet at the co-op counter in May, who'd been farming Pemiscot ground since 1951, called Dale's house on the evening of September 15th. Ruth answered, handed the phone to Dale. "I heard you're harvesting your beans," Charlie said. "Yes, sir," Dale said. "Through the standing corn?" "Yes, sir." A pause on the line, the sound of Charlie breathing. "How's it look?" "About 65% yield," Dale said. "Maybe better, 68 on some passes." Another pause. "That's not nothing," Charlie said. "No," Dale said, "it's not nothing." Charlie cleared his throat. "I should have said something in May." "You didn't say anything against me," Dale said. "That was enough." The corn came off in October, both ears and stalk, through Dale's own aging IH-815 combine that he'd run since 1975. Yield was within normal range for the county, 118 bushels per acre. At $2.78 per bushel, the corn grossed $13,304. The 40 acres had produced soybeans, $7,951.55. Corn, $13,304.4. Total, $21,255.95. From 40 acres of ground that a single crop farmer would have grossed at those same prices, either $4,720 from corn alone or $6,344 from beans alone. Dale Hutchinson had grossed 3.5 times what a single crop farmer would have made from the same ground. When the numbers circulated, and they did circulate because in Pemiscot County numbers always circulate, the silence got a different quality. Gerald Fitch said nothing publicly. He didn't need to. His silence was its own commentary. The winter of 1983-84 was unusually social for Dale Hutchinson. He had never been a man people called for farming advice. He was respected, hard worker, paid his debts, kept his equipment, but he was not the man you called when you wanted to know what to do next. That was Gerald Fitch's role, or Harold Beaumont's, or the extension agent's. After September of 1983, Dale's phone started ringing. Cautiously at first, a neighbor 2 miles down the road who'd heard about the harvest and wanted to know, casually, how the soybean planting timing worked. A farmer from New Madrid County who'd driven by the field in September and wanted to understand the header modifications. A young man named Jeff Keller, 26 years old, who'd inherited his father's 180 acres in January and was trying to figure out how to service the debt without selling ground, who sat at Dale and Ruth's kitchen table for 3 hours one February evening while Dale walked him through every bulletin, every modification, every calculation. Jeff Keller would plant relay intercropped corn and soybeans on 60 acres in 1984. He would do it again in 1985 when corn dropped to $2.23 a bushel and soybeans hit $4.78. In 1986, Jeff Keller would win the Pemiscot County Farm Bureau's Conservation and Innovation Award. Dale would attend the ceremony and shake Jeff's hand and not say much, because Dale Hutchinson was not a man who needed saying much. The University of Missouri Extension Service sent a specialist to Caruthersville in the spring of 1984 to document what Dale had done. The specialist, a young man in his early 30s named Paul Garrett, with a master's degree from Missouri and a genuine enthusiasm for applied agronomy, spent a full day at Dale's farm in April of '84, measuring his modified planter, reviewing his yield records, interviewing Dale with a tape recorder on the kitchen table. The resulting extension publication, Mu Extension Guide G4090, Corn-Soybean Relay Intercropping in Southeast Missouri, a case study, was released in the fall of 1984. It cited Dale Hutchinson by name with his permission. In the filing cabinet in Dale's barn office, that publication went into a manila folder he labeled, Relay Cropping, Done. The commodity price collapse that Dale had anticipated got worse before it got better. Corn sat below $2.50 for much of 1985 and 1986. Soybeans hit $4.65 in the spring of '86, the lowest they'd been in a decade. The farm foreclosures in Pemiscot County that had been whispered about in 1983 became front-page news in the Caruthersville paper by 1985. 8 farms in the county went through foreclosure proceedings in an 18-month period. 2 of them were neighbors of Dale's along the St. Francis River levee. Dale Hutchinson did not lose his farm. He made his land payment every year. He paid off the $22,000 operating debt by the spring of 1985. He kept his 1066 International running. He kept his daughter's Sunday visits going. He watched his grandchildren grow. In 1987, with commodity prices still depressed but agricultural land in the Bootheel at its lowest price in 20 years, Dale Hutchinson bought 40 acres of cropland from the estate of a neighbor who had not made it through the crisis. He paid $620 an acre, a price that, a decade later, would seem almost unimaginably low. He planted it in relay intercrop in the spring of '88. Gerald Fitch was not doing as well. Not because he was a bad man, not because he deserved to suffer, but because the farm equipment business in the Bootheel followed the farm economy, and the farm economy from 1983 to 1987 was a grinding, relentless contraction that took no prisoners and made no exceptions. The $8 $47,000 John Deere 4250s that Gerald had sold to Bootheel farmers on easy financing were now, several of them, coming back through repossession, re-entering a used equipment market that had too much supply and too little demand. Gerald Fitch downsized his dealership in 1986. He let 2 mechanics go and reduced his new equipment floor. He survived, he was a capable man and he adapted, but he never quite recaptured the swagger of that co-op counter moment in May of 1983. Whether he thought about it, nobody knows. Dale never brought it up. In the spring of 1990, Gerald Fitch drove by Dale's operation, the old 40 plus the new 40, and stopped his truck on County Road 318. Dale was working on his planter in the barn lot. Gerald got out of the truck and walked over. They shook hands. Gerald looked at the modified planter units, he looked at the fields, he looked back at Dale. "You figured something out," Gerald said. "Somebody figured it out a long time ago," Dale said. "I just read about it." They stood there in the spring morning, 2 men in late middle age in a flat country, and for a moment, just a moment, something passed between them. Not forgiveness, exactly, because Dale hadn't been wounded enough to need to forgive. Not apology, exactly, because Gerald Fitch was not a man built for formal apology. Just recognition. The recognition of one man by another in the specific language of people who work land for a living. You knew something I didn't. You were right to trust it. Gerald nodded. He got back in his truck and drove away. Dale went back to working on his planter. Let me tell you what I think about when I think about Dale Hutchinson. I think about that manila folder, the one he labeled relay cropping possible in 1978 and relay cropping done in 1984. 6 years between those two labels. 6 years of reading, thinking, waiting, doing the math, checking the regulations, making the phone calls, running the numbers again. 6 years of carrying an idea in a folder in a filing cabinet while the world around him told him, through prices, through mockery, through the accumulated social weight of convention, that this was not how things were done. And then the prices fell the way he'd expected them to fall. And he opened the folder. Let me pause here and ask you one more thing. What folder do you have in your own life? What idea have you been holding for years? An idea that has research behind it, that you've thought through carefully, that you know is sound, that you haven't acted on because the people at the metaphorical fence line are already laughing. The wisdom that saved Dale Hutchinson's farm was not secret. It was not proprietary. It was in a University of Illinois Extension bulletin that any farmer in America could have requested from their county extension office for the cost of a postage stamp. It was available to everyone. But only Dale read it. Only Dale filed it. Only Dale waited for the right moment. And only Dale modified his planter on 3 January evenings in 1983, alone in his barn, with a coffee can of pencils and a tape measure and a pile of salvaged parts from a $340 auction find, turning a bulletin into a reality. The other lesson, and I think this one matters just as much, is about what Dale did not do. He did not mock Gerald Fitch. He did not walk back into that co-op the following spring and say I told you so to the men who'd laughed. He did not write a letter to the Farm Bureau News crowing about his success. He answered his phone when it rang. He sat at his kitchen table with young Jeff Keller for 3 hours in February. He gave the university extension specialist his yield records and his time. He let the work speak. There's a particular kind of confidence that doesn't need applause, doesn't need public vindication, doesn't need the moment when the crowd goes silent and the villain's face falls. It just needs the elevator ticket, the bank deposit, the land payment made, the folder in the filing cabinet. That's the confidence of a man who wasn't farming for the approval of the co-op coffee clutch. He was farming for his family, for his 240 acres, for the grandchildren who visited on Sundays, for the idea that a man who reads carefully and thinks clearly and acts patiently can still find his way through a crisis that takes everyone else down. In the years that followed, as the American farm crisis of the 1980s receded and new challenges came, NAFTA, the ethanol era, the soybean rust scares, the consolidation of agribusiness into fewer and fewer hands, the farmers who survived and even thrived were rarely the ones with the newest equipment or the most borrowed capital. They were more often than not the ones who had taken the time to understand their land deeply, to read, to think. To hold an idea in a folder for 6 years and know, with the quiet, unshakable knowledge of a man who has done the math, when to act. Dale Hutchinson retired from active farming in 1997 when he was 75 years old. He and Ruth sold most of their ground to Tommy, who had come back to Pemiscot County after his degree, and farmed the family land through the 1990s and into the 2000s, adding relay intercropping to his own operation as a matter of course, the way you'd use any tool that works. Dale passed away in 2003. The obituary in the Caruthersville paper listed his survivors, his church membership, his years of farming. It did not mention the 40-acre intercrop of 1983. It did not mention the extension bulletin filed in a manila folder. It did not mention the men at the fence line on County Road 318. But old Charlie Pressler, then 85 years old, one of the few men who remembered that co-op morning in May of 1983, was at the funeral. And afterward, at the church hall, he told the story to anyone who would listen. Which is how stories like this survive. Which is how the lessons get passed on. Which is why we're here today. Take care of your land, read everything, trust the math, and when the prices crash, and they always do, eventually, let your preparation be the thing that answers the laughter. We'll see you next time. Historical context is real. The The farm crisis of the 1983–1987 period, commodity price collapse, relay intercropping research, and the University of Missouri Extension Services documentation of Boothil farming practices are all based on documented history. Dale Hutchinson, Gerald Fitch, and all named characters and dialogue are dramatized for storytelling purposes.